All right, welcome back to our Bible studies. Last week we started looking again, or we actually concluded looking at David and Saul. We've been looking at David, and one of the things that you can do to study David is look at David in his various relationships. When you start looking in First and Second Samuel, you'll find David there with various people. Saul is one that takes up a large part of First Samuel because Saul is the first king. David is going to replace him, and we can see how David forgave Saul, and we learn a lot about David, his Christ-like attitude towards his enemies with Saul. Saul's not the only person we can look at, though. One of the early relationships that we can learn a lot about David from is a man named Jonathan. Now, Jonathan is the son of Saul. Jonathan is actually would be the next in line to be king if it wasn't for David. When you look at Jonathan's life, Jonathan is a really interesting person because we see his father and all the sinful behavior that his father does. We don't actually see anything about his mother. We learn later about some of his brothers and some of his siblings when we get into Second Samuel, as one of them tried to take the throne of Saul. We see his son, but you know, Jonathan himself is a very interesting person, mainly because of his connection with David and his connection with Saul. Saul, being his father, actually set some really bad examples for Jonathan. And what we're going to learn over the next couple of weeks is this relationship that Jonathan found himself in. As he's looking at his father, who's trying to keep his kingdom by any means necessary, and we see David, who is a man after God's own heart and a man that God has chosen, we see David put right in the middle. And I think maybe for some of us, we feel that because we are a person who feels, maybe stuck between God and another person. We see a friend of ours, we see a spouse of ours, we see our children or our parents who maybe are not the best examples, or maybe even people who are actively trying to prevent us from being in a right relationship with God. It's an interesting thing is when you go back into the book of Acts, a lot of the people who should have been the people cheering Christians on and joining Christians were actually the people who were fighting against Christianity. Sometimes the people who are closest to us are the ones who maybe hinder our relationship the most with God. And so we got Saul on this one side, and we see that relationship. And then with David, we see that relationship with God. Now, it may not be just a relationship with God, it may be putting us between two people. Maybe it's one parent who's a believer in God and another parent who's not, or another relationship. So, as we're looking at this, we're going to actually focus in on Jonathan, even though David's a part of this account, and see how hard it can be to be faithful when we're put in the middle. Now, we're going to start this in First Samuel chapter 18. In First Samuel chapter 18, we're going to start to read about Jonathan and David's relationship. Now, we're going to start here, and in the next lesson, we're going to jump into First Samuel chapter 20. And we're going to dive into this hard place Jonathan finds himself in. But I want us to first start looking at this relationship. So we start here with verse 1. When David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan was bound to David in close friendship, and loved him as much as he loved himself. Saul kept David with him from that day on, and did not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him so much as himself. Then Jonathan removed the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with military tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of his fighting men, which pleased all the people and Saul's servants as well. As the troops were coming back, when David was returning from killing the Philistine, the women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, with shouts of joy, and with three stringed instruments. As they danced, the women sang, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. Saul was furious and resented this song. They credited tens of thousands to David, he complained, but only credit me with thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul watched David jealously from that day forward. The next day, an evil spirit from God came powerfully on Saul. He began to rave inside the palace. David was playing the lyre as usual, but Saul was holding a spear, and he threw it thinking, I'll pin David to the wall. But David got away from him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. Therefore, Saul sent David away from him and made him commander over 1,000 men. David led the troops and continued to be successful in all his activities because the Lord was with him. When Saul observed that David was very successful, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he was leading their troops. When we look at this, we start to see where a lot of Saul's jealousy comes from. Number one, when the Spirit of the Lord left him, it left a void, and evil came in. You know, whenever you allow God, or like basically force God out, whether it's intentional, saying, I just don't believe in you anymore, God, or whether it may be something that you don't realize you're doing, saying, I love my sin, I love my sin, I want God, but I love my sin, but you're forcing God out because you cannot have God and your sin. You leave the door open for something else. And there's something else. There was an evil spirit that came into Saul. So evil that even though he saw all that David was doing and David was being victorious time after time, Saul's idea was, we have to kill him. And as we saw the past couple of weeks, we saw how he tried to do this. And this is one of those occasions. He tried to hit him with a spear. But now we turn our attention to Jonathan. Jonathan had entered into a friendship with David. And one of the things that this text is making known is how close this relationship was. Whenever the text is talking about David and Jonathan, it's talking about a friendship. And I want to highlight that word friendship. Some people try to make it into something more than that. No, it was an actual deep, close, personal friendship, a brotherly type of love, and a bond that would not be broken. He enters into this friendship, and he and David start to make an alliance together. Now, this isn't Jonathan just betraying his father. This was just Jonathan seeing David for who he was and what he was, a man after God's own heart, a man that God was choosing. But since he entered into this friendship, he's now going to put himself directly at odds with Saul. Now, this relationship is going to be seen twofold as far as his relationship with Saul. Yes, Jonathan is his son. He is the son of the king, and he has a duty to honor his father as commanded in the scriptures. But Saul is not just his father, he's also his king. Now, as king, Jonathan once again has a duty bound by the scriptures to honor the king. But what about this friendship? What about this bond? You see, it's not going to be an easy thing, and sometimes our relationships are not always easy. When we are having a relationship with the Lord, not everybody is. Saul pretended to, Saul maybe even wanted to, but Saul could not give up his sin enough to enjoy a relationship, a true relationship with God. It was always limited because sin always separates us from God. That's what sin does. It separates us from God. And as a result, it's going to separate Saul and Jonathan. See, that's what sin keeps doing. Sin never unites. Sometimes people try to use sin to unite people. You will never unite people with sin. Not only are you going to divide yourself from God, you're going to divide yourself from the righteous, and even in those who engage in sin, there's still always going to be a division. Sin always divides, it does not unite. The love of God unites. So, whereas in this one side of this relationship, he is going to have this constant division because Saul is in rebellion. on the other side, because David is in a good fellowship with God, and because Jonathan wants to be in a good fellowship with God, that bond is going to be stronger. Your friendship, your marriage, your parent child relationship, any relationship you're talking about will only be strengthened in the Lord. As long as you are both trying to be serving God correctly and wisely. And that's the key here. You both have to be in tune with God, and you both have to be willing to serve God. Jonathan and David are going to end up having to serve God in different ways. David as king, Jonathan as somebody who's going to have to let go of the kingdom. Jonathan is going to be so willing to do this. It's not something that his father's willing to do, but it's something Jonathan is willing to do. So, therefore, that righteous behavior is going to unite them in this bond. So, what happens when this all comes together? See, up to this point, Jonathan's not having to choose. Actually, there's a lot of things Jonathan is not aware of that is happening. This is happening in chapter 18, but in chapter 20, everything is going to come to this root, to this time where now Jonathan is going to be made aware of what his father is doing, made aware of what his father once done, and made aware of the danger that David, the chosen of the Lord, is going to be in. What will he do? What would you do? Now, see, I want you to understand something. In order to best understand the scripture, you're going to have to put yourself in Jonathan's shoes for a moment and ask, what would I do? Because as we talked about before, not every relationship in our life is going to center around the other person serving God. So when that person will not serve God, will not obey God, what will you do? That's what we're going to start looking at next week. So please join us in the next study. It'll be here on this YouTube page or Rumble page, depending on which one you're at. You can find it on Facebook, Twitter, or X, I should say, some other places. Join us if you've liked it. If it's been informational, please like and share. Thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next week.